Hey students, I hope everyone is doing well. I want to take a little bit of time to talk with you today about the temperance movement, which is the next social change movement that we're going to be talking about in this class. The temperance movement, also known as the anti-alcohol movement or the prohibition movement, is roughly associated with the time frame from about 1850 to 1919. And a lot of really good history here in the sense that as a result of the temperance movement, a major organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was formed, gave many women opportunities to participate and engage in leadership, and also became one of the most important organizations for the work of the suffrage movement, which is the next political movement we'll start talking about. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of what this presentation entails. Keep in mind that there are a lot of video links, so when you go through this PowerPoint on Canvas, note all of the links, and those links are very important. So make sure you're clicking on those, that you're watching those videos, because they really do give you a rich history. So as we're talking about the temperance movement, I think one of the interesting questions to ask is, why alcohol reform? Why did women find the need to organize around alcohol, around liquor? And if you take a moment to think about that, I want you to consider what we remember about women's lives, what we know about the rights that women had in society during this time, and think a little bit about what the implications of alcohol and alcohol abuse could have had on the lives of women and on the lives of children as well. The temperance movement emerged during a time right after the Civil War. There were a lot of immigrants that were coming to the United States from Ireland, Germany, Italy, various countries throughout Europe. And the brewing business was actually scaling up production in order to meet the demands of these immigrants who actually indulged quite a bit in alcohol in their own countries. By 1830, the average American over 15 consumed about 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year. It's about 3 times as much as we consume today. Alcohol was also very big business. Americans spent over $1 billion on alcoholic beverages. And the interesting thing is we compare this to something like $900 million on meat, less than $200 million on public education. So as we can see, the alcohol industry was booming. In particular, women were impacted by this rise in the use of alcohol, partially because of the link between alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse. And this was wreaking havoc on many American families. If we think about that even in terms of our society today, we oftentimes know that there are, periods in a year or over time when we know that domestic violence rates go up, when violence rates against women go up. And oftentimes these are around celebratory times, such as the Super Bowl, oftentimes being reported as one of the days where there are the most reports of domestic violence. And we know that oftentimes these days are associated with increased alcohol use. So this connection that we see is one that makes sense to us, because we see that this is still a situation that women deal with today. So what we started to see was wives and mothers starting to protest and organize politically around temperance. And there was this growing awareness of alcoholism. If you notice right underneath here, we see Roots of Prohibition, the absolute shall, and just know that that is going to be a link to a video that you'll be able to find on Canvas. That video is going to tell you a little bit more about prohibition and how that movement formed and what it looked like. But I want to talk for a moment about the Women's Crusade. The Women's Crusade was one of the first attempts by women to mobilize politically around temperance. Now, as you can see from looking at the dates, it was 1873 to 1874. So you're probably thinking that's not a very long social movement. And you're absolutely right. Although the temperance movement lasted many years, the Women's Crusade was one particular form of organizing that happened. It was a very impromptu way of women coming around, mobilizing around, I should say, alcohol and alcohol reform. Next slide is going to show you a short documentary of the temperance movement and is going to speak a little bit more about the Women's Crusade. So what was the Women's Crusade? Well, keep in mind, there were no legal protections for women and children as they were experiencing the negative implications of alcoholism, such as assault, sexual assault, physical assault. We have to keep in mind that during society at this time, there were really no real repercussions for these types of forms of violence against women. Prosecutions for rape were very rare, and the state regulated age of consent at that time was as low as 7 years old. So yes, we are saying that at that time, it was perceived that a 7-year-old girl could consent. So as you can see, as wives and as mothers, this was problematic. So as alcohol use is growing, these violences against women and children are growing as well. The crusade against alcohol was a protest by women to protect women and families. And basically, the crusade sought to persuade saloon keepers to destroy their beverages and to close their businesses. So really what they were doing was using forms of direct action in order to influence saloon owners, bar owners, to stop serving alcohol and hopefully to never serve alcohol again. Keeping in mind, women had no political or legal power at this time, so we have to think, what forms of activism could they have used? The direct action that they used were things such as prayer visuals, petition campaigns, demonstrations. Women sang hymns in front of the saloons, hoping that the men that come to the saloons would see a bunch of women singing in front of them and they would leave and go away. So during this time, as you can see, the forms of resistance that were used by women, just as with the abolitionist movement, the forms of resistance were largely in the form of writing and speaking. We see that during the temperance movement, the early forms of resistance were in the forms of praying and singing. But the thing is that women were coming out in mass to do it. And it could be very intimidating to see a group of women all singing hymns or reading Bible verses as you're walking up to a saloon. So it was impactful. The problem was that it wasn't impactful for a very long period of time. It was hard for women, wives, children with children to come out and remain active and stay mobilized politically for long periods of time. So the movement was short because women actually were, I guess women went back to the home, we'll say. I guess early on, we can say as political organizers, women had a little bit to learn about how to balance and how to juggle those responsibilities, but also how to feel as if they could truly be activists and as if this wasn't something that was problematic in terms of their role as women. Again, there's another link here that you can check out. It's going to tell you a little bit more about the Women's Crusade. Also, there are a few important individuals. I'm just going to go right back here. Eliza Jane Thompson was mentioned on this slide, so go ahead and take a look at her story, also discussed in that video. Eliza Stewart was another key figure in the women's movement. She organized women through the town, going to saloons and praying, asking owners to sign pledges to no longer sell alcohol. By 1875, more than 130 other communities around the state had also experienced these types of women's crusade demonstrations, and it actually became known as the Ohio Whiskey War, as the Crusade women really did have an impact on the saloon and liquor industry. But once again, as I mentioned, it was kind of a short lived movement for many of the reasons that I had discussed just a few moments ago. But it gave rise to a second movement that actually became um, just as powerful and definitely more noteworthy. Some of you may have heard of Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was associated with a movement called the Home Defenders. And the Home Defenders took a much more, um, how do I say it, physical approach to addressing the issue of prohibition. The home defenders were actually known for going into saloons and attacking the establishments. Carrie Nation was very well known for smashing up saloons with her favorite instrument, which was a hatchet. And she would actually go into the bars and saloons and start hacking up things, tearing things up. The saloon owners would panic when they saw Carrie Nation coming. She's actually very well known for that particular action. But as a movement, the Home Defenders were known as having that form of a tactic that was used as they thought about ways in which to fight against alcohol abuse. Again, another video that's attached to this slide that'll tell you a little bit more about the Home Defenders, so make sure you check that out. So enter the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is a very important organization for us to learn about as we think not only about the role of women in the temperance movement, but also the role that women played as they became active in the suffrage movement. A short documentary follows this slide as well on the Christian Temperance Union. Please make sure that you view that as well. Just to give you a little background on the Temperance Union, it was founded in Cleveland in 1874, and it really grew out of the Women's Crusade, that movement that we were talking about, 1873 to 1874. The WCTU was formed by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frances Willard. And these names are going to be very familiar because these are also the women that were very instrumental in the formation of the suffrage movement. The organization launched a full political movement for prohibition, and there were about 250,000 members in chapters all across the state. Frances Willard was the first leader and president of the WCTU. She took leadership in 1879 and basically led one of the most influential women's groups of the 19th century. And she expanded their platform beyond alcohol to talk about labor laws, prison reform, as well as suffrage. Her philosophy was home protection, and her goal was to try to appeal to women's consciousness, home protection. So the idea that being engaged in the temperance movement was about protecting the home. And very interestingly, as the suffrage movement started to develop, it was this home protection movement that was used as the basis for thinking about why women needed the vote. So as Willard and Anthony and Cady Stanton began thinking about mobilizing women around the vote, they were very much using this very consciously chosen slogan of home protection, telling women that the only way that you can end alcohol abuse, the only way you can protect your home, your family, your children, is to have the vote so that you can vote this way. And so that became a very important topic. Temperance became a very important topic as it related to the suffrage movement. Again, another video down here at the bottom that will talk a little bit more about Frances Willard and her role in the WCTU.